This is Scape at Project 88 in Mumbai with 6 South Asian artists, Amol K Patil, Malik Irtiza, Moonis Ahmad, Sonal Jain, Soumya Netrabile, as well as Tejal, Shah. This is an exhibition that contends with the thresholds of language, geopolitics, as well as aesthetics, especially within the immense ruptures that we find ourselves. Geopolitical rupture, genocide, madness, climate collapse, and so on. How do we find new vocabularies and new lexicons to express, to contend and reckon with the incomprehensible? This exhibition, Scape, thinking about landscape, thinking about escape, thinking about hellscapes, capitalist scapes, as well as escapes and scapegoats, things about how we can sort of slip off the precipice of known and governable landscapes and languages in order to find a different terrain altogether. And each one of the 6 artists opens up a sort of portal into that. This is the work of Moonis Ahmad Shah. It's called Gul A Curfew, which is a series of prints and texts, 7 pairs to be exact. And these are these ecological plant-like beings that only grow within and take root within sort of contested territories. And this sort of spans the world. So we see sort of ecological beings from the Gaza Strip, from Syria, from Kashmir, from prisons, from asylums. And what Ahmed does here is he's taken hundreds of photographs in different contested territories, mostly in Kashmir, some across the world. And he's created and generated these images from those photographs, but they kind of look like rhizomatic or mycological or plant-like or flower-like sort of floral creatures in a way. And what he's doing here is sort of contesting our idea of these floral beings as sort of passive, receptive creatures or landscapes. But instead, what they do here are to become incredibly active agents. They create and cause madness and dysphoria and disillusion or muteness or a loss of language altogether. They very actively change and shape and form the communities around them within which they exist. And as you see here with the text, you have the anatomy of the ecological becoming, and you have the lifespan that is very much part of the artwork as well. And the lifespans tend to be quite short. So it is also kind of referring to the precarity, the temporal precarity of communities, of beings that do live in these contested landscapes, of not knowing what the sort of biopolitical and necropolitical thresholds of their own lives are, the governing logics of their lives. And for this exhibition, since it's sort of about the rupture of language, I didn't want blocks of text to hit the visitor as soon as they came in, and instead we opted for these little fragments of language, these invitations to the audiences, as well as these connective threads for the assemblage of this entire exhibition that sort of flow from one portal, from one artist into another. These are paintings by Soumya Netrabile, who was born in Bangalore and now lives and works in Chicago, but all has continued to work with ecologies and landscapes from her childhood and from her present life. This sort of connects to Moonis's work in the way that it also activates nature and landscapes with the sort of visceral life force and this energy that is deeply evident in her work. She sort of exhumes the latent energy within the landscapes that she observes and sees sort of under her feet, around her, sort of changing the axes of spectatorship between nature and herself, herself and her work, the work and the viewer, and thus the viewer and nature. Her work sort of contends with both the whimsy and the sort of violence of nature in equal measure. She deals, and her work spans a huge spectrum of topics from ecofeminist mythology and religious figures. For example, this one is called Lilith. This one is called Floodplain and Things Through Natural Disaster, but not in any way that is morally or didactically sort of prescriptive, but simply sort of exhumes the energy and the force of nature in a way that allows the viewer to sit and dwell with the questions, with the force of the work itself. This is a work called Black Finger. At first glance, it might not be quite evident what she's depicting, but if you look closely, this is actually her experience of contending with tornadoes in the Midwest, in America. As you can see, there is of course, you see the sheer power of nature sort of like coming at you through this painting, but there's also a delicateness, there's a tenderness, there's a way of playing with light in a way that is so deeply observed in her work. This is a series of prints by the artist Tejal Shah. In 2017, Tejal began to look through hundreds of images of dead bodies across the internet, across media outlets and newspapers, and out of which she sort of selected these three for this specific show, Scape. These are the bodies of migrants who failed in their attempts to reach new lands, and their bodies sort of washed up ashore. And then we have the fourth print, which is a sinking inflatable raft that was also photographed and that she isolated from its context. So what she has done with these prints is sort of extract them very carefully from their surrounding sort of deathscape, if you will, their conditions of dying, and sort of very tenderly place them in the suspended space, in the suspended non-space, non-time that we have to really contend with what these bodies mean, with what the violence that we've allowed to sort of unfold in the world, to sit with that for a while, which is why the series of prints is called Unbecoming, and unbecoming in a multitude of ways. So Tejal's work is also deeply ensconced in Tibetan Buddhist practices. So unbecoming also sort of includes this idea of spiritual unbecoming, of sort of transcending the body and transcending life. So all of these sort of put together brings us to this this work, Unbecoming. So for Tejal as well, I think a deep question is, what compels us to look at or look away from such images of human cruelty and of violence, of what we've allowed to unfold and happen in this world, especially in like warm and safe gallery spaces, right? So sort of moving on from Soumya's work, we do look at nature. These are technically natural deaths, but are also very much human-made in terms of the geopolitics and the necropolitics of the circumstances that circumscribe the deaths and the bodies that we see in this work. When we're sitting with such heavy questions and areas of inquiry, I think it's also incredibly important that we have space for rest and reflection and play and just hanging out, which is why in collaboration with the artist Sonal Jain, whose work Puri you can find in this space, we created this oasis, this sort of space for watery rest. And you can nap here, you can read the book here, you can sit with the material of this entire exhibition and of the work Puri, or you can just take a respite from it, which we think is important. So Sonal Jain's work is set in the Khasi Hills of present-day Meghalaya, and the word Puri refers to local water spirits that are in the northeast. This is an artist's book that contends with gendered mythologies, with indigenous vocabularies around watery histories as well as water bodies, but also with the questions of water governance from British era colonialism and so on. And this is based on a series of research and conversations that she's had for several decades as she's based in the region and from the region with local stakeholders that open up questions of how do we possess language and how does language possess us? What does it mean to be possessed? There are lots of stories of people being possessed by these puris within this artistic text. And we enter these hallucinatory sort of states of in-between being, different states of being, liminal states of being, where we lose language, we lose our sense of self before returning to new states of self. So this work really brings us to an oniric, kind of dreamy, kind of eerie space, but also one of rest and fluidity in this exhibition. And on the other side of the wall, where we just came from a space of rest, we have a work that contends very much with questions of labor and working bodies. This is Amol K Patil's sculpture, which is called Who is Invited to the City? The work comes from three different points of navigation of rural to urban migration across Delhi, across Bombay, and the Konkani coast. So Amol's work is very much imbricated within questions of who builds cities and who gets to live within them and how. So we see here a very contorted, a very convoluted outline of a worker's body, but we also see protests that the bodies are sort of undertaking. So you have the foot here, which signifies a march of protest. We have a hand here, which is raised in defiance against the myth of the big dream in the big city, which promises these non-futures to migrant workers, which they never really quite reach. It's a horizon that's ever shifting, that is ever moving. And at the same time, you have this light, which is sort of pulsating with a strange luminosity in the middle of this exhibition. It sort of recalls a state of being in meditation, of slumbering, these states of rest that are actually not quite afforded to migrant workers and the working class in a way that allows them to enter these states of being. And at the same time, we find that there is whimsy and there is play and there's intimacy and warmth within the sculpture and within Amol's work as well, because these are also affects and realities that circumscribe the journeys that these workers undertake from their villages to the big city. This is a short film and audiovisual work by a very young Kashmiri artist, Malik Irtiza. It's called Thuk, which means to spit. It follows this shadowy figure called the Shok Basin, which is this figure from Irtiza's childhood, from the stories that her mother used to tell her. Shok Basin is this character that used to be a songbird, but has sort of become this shadowy non-being, this sort of glitch, this sort of trace that is refusing to sort of enter the void of life, refusing to enter the void. And Shok Basin kind of populates strange lands. Over here, we see him in this watery landscape, which follows on quite well from Tejal's work as well. But we enter this underwater world of sort of fishy frenzy and this turmoil, and we hear Kashmiri lullabies and protests, as well as sort of enter this bubbling, haunting, sonic and watery landscape. I think with Irtiza's work, it's quite hard to find easy legibility in her work. It often straddles the fantastical and the political at the same time, but through these sort of mythic, fabulistic narratives that she builds in her stories. These little bits of text are sort of littered across the entire exhibition. I see them as this potential connective tissue which exists between the different nodes and the portals of the artworks. So, for example, this is the first one that visitors will probably see as soon as they walk into the gallery, which is an invitation to commingle, to fall, and to learn. And for me, that is an important entry point into the entire exhibition. Here's another text. It's sort of on the beam, so you can see it from across the entire exhibition, but especially when you're sitting in Sonal's space or looking at Soumya's works from here. It says, "Hold and be held." This for me is a moment of softness and tenderness, which is to hold the immensity of the questions that are being asked within this exhibition, but also to allow yourself to be held by your kinships, by some of the works, by your own ways of coping with these immense questions in the world. So the word scape, apart from being obviously a suffix in all of the ways that we've seen, also actually means the part of the stalk that emerges directly from the root. And so I see each of these artists and these artworks as being deeply rooted in their own local or geopolitical or aesthetic context and their vocabularies, but sort of put in conjunction and conversation with one another, open up these massive ontological questions that span planetary and very located scales as well.